Yeah, welcome to this first lecture of European integration. This is a course that I've been giving for 20 years now. Started giving it in 1998 and then stopped for a few semesters and started up again. It was on demand from a lot of students who wanted to see some applied economics, applied to a very economic set of issues, those involving the European situation, the integration of Europe. Why does Europe exist as a union, and whether it's really feasible at all to have an economic union, and whether it's justified. So, applying economics to this set of issues is really exciting. Gives you a chance to use a lot of the theory that you've learned in many courses. So, like I said, welcome. This is a basic introduction. It's a bachelor level course. There won't be a lot of math. There won't be a lot of formality. There will be a fair amount of thinking. So a lot of what I'll be doing will be using graphical methods. There will be a little math, of course, because you've taken Macro 1, possibly Macro 2, and you may have learned it in a totally different way of, different approach, using a lot of equations and maybe a few diagrams. We're going to rely mostly on just logical thinking, because that's the way you'll be thinking in 20 years if you don't go into economics as a profession. That's my objective today, okay? So we'll start out with some administrative details. This is about you asking questions in the process of learning about European integration, so I'd like to have feedback from you. So the idea would be, optimally, that you look at the videos on YouTube before you come in, maybe do a reading or two, and have some questions in your head when you come. Raise your hand, and I can answer them, even though Jakob is making a movie of this business. There's nothing wrong with having a question. I'll repeat it, and maybe people can, hey, I was asking that question too. I wanted to know something about that. And then maybe I can try to answer the question, right? So it's European integration is a huge mess. It's a huge set of issues that have not yet been resolved. It's a microcosm of German unification. German unification is a good example of how we think about the European integration process, but you can extend it to the integration of two halves of this city, for example, or the integration between Belgium and the Netherlands, or within Belgium. So there are all sorts of different fractile ways of thinking about these issues. So let me give you an outline of the course, and then we'll talk about the issue of European integration, what it means to me personally, and what it may mean to you. We'll be talking about economics, but there's also a political element, which is sometimes impossible to divorce from the economics, right? Politics and economics that's why it's so exciting. We'll talk about the real side of the economy for the first half of the course, and I'll get into detail in a second. We'll talk about the monetary issues, which a lot of people are concerned about. Why do we have a European central bank? Many of you were born after the decision was taken to have a European central bank. Some of you might even be even younger than that. So the euro's been around since 1999, in paper form since 2002. So it's been a while. The project has not exploded. We still have it. In fact, it's even been extended to many new countries. So it's an exciting project, understanding why it works. Why would you want to do that? Does it have disadvantages or advantages? That's the key set of issues that you didn't learn about in macroeconomics or microeconomics, but you'll learn about it this semester. I'll talk about positive analysis versus normative analysis. Now, just to get things rolling, does anybody know what that means? Anybody know what positive analysis, economic analysis, what is positive economics? It doesn't mean we're positive about it, but it means, yeah.
So in positive economics, it's normative explanation, just like how the economics is, how it works, and by normative analysis, we do prescriptions.
Right, so positive means analyzing the way economic agents interact and what happens, understanding what's happening, as opposed to trying to make a prescription, because in our hearts we might want to have more equality, less pollution, more economic growth, maybe less economic growth. But the key question before we can pass a judgment is to understand, why do we have unemployment? Why do we have pollution? Why do we have inflation? So understanding those positive aspects. And Milton Friedman was the first guy who wrote this down as positive economics, but it's been around a long time, 200 years. Adam Smith made these observations. Let's understand what's going on before we make a judgment. Okay, and some people would claim, Karl Marx, for example, that this is impossible. Your economic situation predetermines your judgment. But let's try the other approach first. Let's try to separate our hearts from our minds and discuss the way things are, and maybe we can make some progress. We'll talk about that in detail. We'll talk about, like I said, think of various places in Europe as being crucibles for this process. We think of Germany after unification. Think of Berlin after unification. I came here in 1992. It was really exciting back then because East and West looked very different. Now you go to East Berlin, it looks better than West Berlin in some places. It wasn't like that in 1992. Okay? And if you go to Eastern Europe, many parts of Romania and Bulgaria look like East Germany did in 1992. But they're moving up, they're moving forward, right? So this process, this dynamic process is alive and proceeding before our very eyes. We can look at it in very different places, and that's why I like to focus on these different regions as examples of this work in progress. And I'd like to give you a short integration history lesson on what happened after World War II, or even before, if you like. But most importantly, Europe has moved forward since World War II. So World War II was a defining event in the economic history of Europe. A lot of destruction on the measure that we see in Ukraine today, but everywhere, you know? And starting from scratch gave Europe a chance, an opportunity to do something better and, you know, move towards some better situation economically, but also politically. Gives us an idea of where the European project comes from and where it's going. Because there have been some setbacks. I'll talk about Brexit, and we'll have some guest speakers to talk about Brexit in the course later on in June. And then I'll do some economics. Okay, so I'll end with an introduction to what we'll be doing for most of the course. So if you get turned off at this point, you should probably not come next week because it's about economics. It's not about markets. It's about the Samuelson question. It's not about the way firms behave necessarily, or do we need firms? It's really about what system is best suited to allocate resources. Okay, so that Samuelson question, I call it, because Paul Samuelson was the first economist to put it in those terms. It's not about, I like free markets, I like liberated, regulated, whatever, I like socialism. It's about how do we allocate scarce resources. That's what economics is about. So Europe is trying to figure out a way to make itself better off by allocating labor and capital and other factors of production in a way that's effective, that makes us better off. Okay, so it's better to have lunch. If you don't have lunch, you may be hungry. It's better to have good health care. It's better to have streets that are paved rather than dirt roads. All these things are about how we can mobilize resources to make us better off. That's the Samuelson question. Markets are probably the best way to do this. As an aggregator of individual preferences and tastes and technological possibilities, markets seem to work pretty well. Sometimes when they're not regulated properly, they go crazy and we have problems. But in the end, the judgment of economics has been in a normative sense. Okay, to say if we want to maximize human welfare, maybe having some market influence, having competition is probably the way to go. Okay, but you see I've already drifted into a normative question. But the positive question is how do these mechanisms take place? And to do that, we need to go do some economics. At the very basic level I'll talk about an Edgeworth box. An Edgeworth box that decides, well, if we use factor of production for this, we can't use it for that. It's an exclusion, right? If I eat the cake, you can't eat it. That's the consumption side. But on the production side, we can use the same idea. We'll call that the modified Edgeworth box, and I'll show you how Europe is basically one big Edgeworth box. How do you mobilize capital and labor to do the best you can in terms of output to make us better off? So that's the fundamental economic question I'll talk about. Okay, so let's do some administrative stuff really quickly. There is a textbook that I'd like you to buy. I know a lot of you may not have a lot of money, but you can get it on the used market. It's a great textbook, and it's not mostly about what's in this course, but it's about a lot of stuff that's interesting for you as a lifetime project, because you're European. So if you're going to be living here for the rest of your lives, you might as well figure out what Europe stands for, what stands behind Europe in terms of history. Europe has a lot of history, loaded with bad history and a lot of good history, right? A lot of economic history. The economic progress we've made in markets in my field has been in Europe, okay? Think about that. And you might want to get this book. This is a book by Richard Baldwin and Charles Wyplow. It's called Economics of European Integration. It's now in its 6th or 7th edition. It's a great book. It's very thin. I recommend it highly. It won't help you pass the course, but it'll help you develop your own knowledge. A lot of the stuff that we do is in there. A lot of stuff we don't do is not in there. A lot of stuff we do is not in there. So be aware that it's an overlapping project. It's just a recommendation. And the book is very inexpensive if you buy it used. And you can resell it. That's the great thing about books. They're like capital. Okay? All this is available on Moodle. My strong suggestion is that if you want to come prepared for the class, do the YouTube lecture first. I'm not trying to get clicks. I don't care. Not yet. But on the other hand, it's really useful to develop some ideas. The lectures are very structured, similar to what we're doing now. These were 2015, so these are really old. This is before Brexit. Okay, so you might think about watching the new YouTube videos as they come to light. So it's really about a visualization of the course with slides and discussion. There's a final exam. There's only one Leistungsprüfung. Okay, there's only one. This is the final exam. I can't give you problem sets, but we will have problem sets that you can answer optionally and come to the section, the repetition, the review section, which will be led by Berfin Kandaschla, who's sitting here. She came kindly to watch. She's a graduate student, really sharp cookie. She'll be teaching you basically a repetition of what we've done through the lecture expressed in the form of problem sets. And these problem sets are highly correlated with the final exam. In fact, I can promise you that half of the questions on the final will look like these problem sets. In fact, they may even be these problem sets. Okay, so there's an incentive for you to go to the section, ask her questions, and then get some feedback. Okay, because there's a lot of material. But like I say, I'd like you to learn how to apply economics. My objective in this undergraduate course is always to teach undergraduates how to apply economics. Just memorizing a bunch of rules or deriving a bunch of first-order conditions is not enough. It's nice to really understand what's behind it, because we're doing this for a reason. We're doing this to help humanity improve the use of available resources without hurting other people, right? You can always steal stuff from other people, but it wouldn't be better if we got together and figured out ways to make more out of what we have. That's what economics is about. Okay, so it's important that you come to class. There's a special lecture in mid-May. We'll have someone from the Irish Embassy to come speak to us about the impact of Brexit on Ireland, on Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland and Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, are integrating as we speak, exactly the way this course is teaching us. And because it did, people in Northern Ireland are really torn between whether they really want to leave the EU or not. And many of them feel very political about it, so you can't separate the political from the economic, but all the same, in the end, people want to have food on the table, and they want to have maybe good health and way to get around. And those are the important things that economics tries to deal with. Okay, so if you can watch the video before lecture, you'll have a question, you can ask, and if you have a question, raise your hand, I'll answer it. I can't walk around like I used to because I'm being taped right now, but in general, it's more fun if we can have a dialogue. And this is kind of a special offer. Okay, I did this every year with some extra money that I've been able to raise under various conditions to fund a trip somewhere in Poland or in Eastern Germany. It's not so interesting anymore. We used to go to Schwedt, the big refinery, which is also interesting now because of the sanctions. But, I mean, if you like to see lots of capital, That's a great opportunity. It's huge. You know, the refinery is, I'd never seen a refinery before. We won't go there this year. We'll go somewhere else. We may go to Gubin, okay, or Gubin. So that's a cool city, integrating two halves of one city before World War II. Very interesting to see what's going on there. Okay? So let's discuss the Bachelorarbeit really quickly. So some of you may be interested in doing a bachelor's thesis. I only do bachelor theses under one set of conditions. You have to take this course, you have to pass the final, and you have to participate in this auction where you literally buy a topic on which you can write your thesis. Okay, it's a 25-page thesis. I accept up to 25 students. We'll talk about it more in detail. Bethine will mention a few details in the section. It's on Moodle as well. There'll be a handout. So the idea is you get 100 euros. You can bid on a topic, or you can bid on a date when you can actually turn in your thesis. That's important for some people because you want to have a summer job or you want to do an internship somewhere. You need to think hard about this. And this auction will take place in May. Okay, and that'll give you the chance to, and some people took this course last year, so they want to write a thesis this year, and that's okay. You can keep the ticket, so to speak. Those are not relevant for you, but if you want to write a thesis, you'll have to pass the final, and that's in July. So after that, you can do your thesis. You get your topic, and you can run off and do your thesis. Okay, so we can talk about that later in detail. We'll actually have a special session on that. Discussing how that works. Okay, so let's talk about the course now. Let's talk about material. Are there any questions before I get going? Any other questions about details? Again, you can ask Bethine later. You can send me an email. I answer emails. Yes. Sorry? The Moodle password. Say it again. Ursula von der Leyen. 23 or 2023? Yeah, just 23. Okay. We're always trying to be very innovative. So now the whole world knows. It's not a big deal. It should be open, actually. We wanted to have it open access. And when I go back to my office, I will make it open so you can look at it for 2 weeks, and then you can do what you want. So this is an outline first. A lot of the stuff is whited out. You can't see it. It's blanked out. But I'll make it available as we go through because I don't want to give you the old slides. The new slides are better. They're always better. Okay? So part one is the real part of European integration, how the real side of the economic systems work. We'll talk about today definition and mechanisms of economic integration by way of introduction. Then, after we've determined that capital is very important for economic growth, we'll talk about the ways that European countries kind of converge to each other. So we'll talk about the solo model, basic stuff. You learned it in the Macro I course. How does that apply to Europe? How can we think about that? Under what conditions can we use the solo model to think about convergence? We'll talk about capital mobility, because if you agree that capital is important, it's better to have lots of machines, lots of computers, lots of trucks, cranes, good highways, as opposed to not having those things. Then you think that having more of those things is one way to grow, and if that stuff is more productive in less developed parts of Europe, it makes sense to move that stuff there. That's exactly what happened in the wake of European integration following the unification of Germany, for example, or following the opening of Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Romania, Bulgaria, the Baltic states to trade with the developed parts of Western Europe. But most importantly, it was about moving capital there. Before the trade occurred, a lot of companies thought about just moving production facilities to those countries. Okay, but of course, trade is the most important thing. We'll talk about that in a second. Another way that countries can integrate is labor mobility. So workers can move. The labor can move instead of the capital moving. And then the most interesting part for me is that trade can bring about integration without capital or labor having to move. Fun fact. Trade can be a substitute for capital mobility and labor mobility. That's an old idea that Robert Mundell thought of in the 1950s, right? And it's true. He was looking at Canada and the United States. It turns out you can think about the regions of Europe. You can think about Eastern or Western Germany. You know, if those regions trade a lot, maybe they can sort of eliminate through relative specialization the differences that occur because of inadequate capital allocation in the poor country. Okay, so this is an alternative. Now, it may not always work, so we have lots of qualifications. There are reasons why this doesn't work. So you can have trade as an integrating factor. It can also be a factor that may make things worse. Okay, so some well-off countries may, because of monopoly power or because of increasing returns to scale, may become sort of like imperialists with respect to other regions. And a good economist has to admit that. It's not about your belief in the free market. It's about the positive part, not the normative part of economics. What happens if we let one company or one international, multinational company take over and start to exploit in a very normal market process poor countries? And this can happen under lots of different guises. And one of them is actually the increased use of the internet, right? Superstar companies and superstar countries can also break up the gains from trade that we assume always exist, but not always actually are realized. Okay, so we'll talk about the labor market because that's where people are impacted the most. People are unemployed sometimes. They may become unemployed because their businesses that were doing well 20 years ago suddenly are losing market position because of competition. Makes you better as a consumer, but not necessarily as a worker. So how do we deal with that as economists, right? Are the gains from trade always distributed fairly among the participants? Okay, so that's kind of the ultimate first part of the course. You should end with a critical note. Trade is good, not always and everywhere for everyone. We have to redistribute the gains to those who lose, because there will be losers from trade. There's no question about it. It's very seldom you have a win-win situation. And then I'll finally talk about how, even if Europe manages to redistribute its capital and labor in a way that makes sense in terms of efficiency, there may not be enough spread of technology and information and freedom of markets. And that's why the European Union exists. It's a way of enforcing this equality of opportunity. Okay, so it's not going to work well if one country allows one monopolist to take over the market and become a national champion, and while the poor people don't get to realize the gains from trade because it's all going into the pockets of the owner of that firm. So that's the interesting contradiction we have with integration. We have to be critical about that. That's why I'm teaching this course. And rule of law is important. So you want to have laws that protect competition. You want to make it easy to enter the market and compete with the guys making all the money. That's the way economics helps us. Because if a firm is doing well, it means it's a signal to the market that maybe more people should be doing what that firm's doing and offering those products at lower prices that we can all benefit from. Okay, so and I would like to conclude with a guest lecture. Like I said, I haven't made the final date yet when this is going to happen, but it's going to be a great lecture. It's coming from a country that's very small and very vulnerable in some sense, but has done very well in terms of economic integration. I'll show you that. Ireland has done extremely well, and that's why Ireland is a hidden benefactor from Brexit, because a lot of what normally business that went to the UK is now going to Ireland, because the Irish people speak English. English is still the lingua franca of the European Union. I'm giving this course in English because the students wanted me to do that. It's my mother tongue, okay? So I could probably give this course in German like I used to in the 1990s and 2000s, but I think it's kind of appropriate to remember the paradox of the EU is they use English now, and there's only one country that really uses English as a primary language. It's not even their historically primary language, right? Historically speaking. So it's a paradox. The second part of the course is about macro. So if you liked Macro 1, if you liked Macro 2, you'll have a lot of fun with this. But it's, again, to make this accessible to everyone, we're not going to do Euler equations. We're not going to use Dynar to solve models in this course. Okay, this is about thinking, because prior to doing that stuff, prior to programming a DSGE model and simulating it with 2 countries and flexible exchange rates, you need to understand kind of where you think the world is going to go under those conditions. So I'm not going to do that stuff in this course. We're going to use figures, diagrams. A lot of the information can be efficiently expressed in a 2-dimensional diagram. So we'll start by looking at the macroeconomics of fixed exchange rates under, if you took my course, if you took my version of macro, you'll know what I'm talking about. Then I'll talk about the European monetary system, which is the biggest experiment we've had in the 20th century, introducing a common currency to countries that were completely unrelated to each other except the fact they may have fought a few wars. Okay? Speak different languages. Crazy, right? But there must have been a good reason for it. And there is a good reason for it. And I'm going to come down on the success side. The European monetary system was the precursor to the euro. Everyone kind of knew, starting with the Werner report in the 1970s, in the early 1971 or 70, that this was a good idea under certain conditions. Moving to a system of fixed exchange rates was the first step. Okay, it wasn't the final step. A lot of countries said, we're not going to do this after all. We'll have our own currency. But a lot of them that did and managed to do well went the final step in 1999, the introduction of the euro. And I'll talk about the theory of monetary union, the theory of an optimal currency area. Under what conditions does it make sense for China, for example, to have a single currency? That's a huge place, right? The United States, huge country. There used to be different dollars in different parts of the United States, especially after the Civil War, right? There were, or before and during the Civil War. Banks used to issue currency, and there used to be dollars from different banks, and they used to trade in an open market. So there's no reason to assume that you have to have a single currency. But governments kind of like having a single currency because it means they can use this as a way of generating resources for their own budget. And this is what we call seigniorage, the idea of creating money that people use, and as a side benefit, you get to use the money as a government to spend it on paying civil servants and building roads, building armies. So it's no accident that a lot of dictators like to put their hands on the central bank, okay? But there must be some economics behind it. There must be some reason to have an optimal currency area, right? There must be. Otherwise, or is it just a power grab? Well, the answer is no, it's not a power grab. It could be economic gains from having a single currency that outweigh the potential losses. Okay? And then, of course, we'll ask whether Europe meets those conditions. I'll talk about the European Monetary Union. I'll talk about the European Central Bank and the way it works. We'll talk about some details. It's exciting. Some people think it's boring. It is really amazing that we have this institution, the only pan-European institution that had the power to deal with the pandemic immediately. Okay? Because I don't know if you noticed this, but when the pandemic was happening, the price of European bonds issued by certain governments was going down the toilet, okay? And because markets were speculating that these countries weren't going to make it. And the European Central Bank was the only organization, the only European institution that could intervene so quickly and put an end to that, okay? Whether that's a good thing always or not is a question we'll have to answer. We'll talk about what this means for the governments of the European Union, the governments of the members of the euro, because those aren't the same. Okay, if you're a country that participates in the euro, you have a special set of ropes around your back that you can't do certain things because you can't issue debt in unlimited amounts or print money. You can't print money at all. European Monetary Union means you cannot create your own money anymore. You can create conditions that make it important that you have a stable fiscal policy because, in some sense, if you finance too much of your budget deficits over time with debt, then the fiscal authority may force the monetary authority to intervene on its behalf. So a lot of people look skeptically on Southern Europe in the early 2000s and rightfully so, because they were violating the agreements that they had gone into to keep budget deficits low, as did Europe, Germany and France, actually. Okay, so these are things we'll have to talk about. And then finally, we'll talk about this crisis that we had when in 2014, and even before that in 2009, when the value of the debt of Greece, of Italy, Spain, Portugal dropped dramatically, and the interest rates implied rose dramatically, meaning these countries had a refinancing problem. They couldn't borrow money to pay off the previous debtors, and therefore they were in trouble. And then the euro was kind of, the project was endangered. Now we have inflation. That's the new challenge. And if you remember your macro, in the long run, money growth is the cause of inflation. Money growth relative to the economic growth of a region or country. So if you don't believe that, look at the case of Turkey. In the past 60 years, Turkish monetary growth has been about 35% per annum. And economic growth in Turkey was about 4.5%. And inflation was about 29%. If you take the exponential, formula, I mean, those are high growth rates. How long does it take for something to double if you're growing at 30% a year? It doesn't take long. It takes less than 3 years. Okay? So when you have exponential growth, you're growing on the basis of your previous growth. And the point is, in the long run, monetary growth is relative to economic growth is the ultimate cause of inflation. But in the short run, anything's possible. We haven't seen that kind of monetary growth in Europe yet. Okay? But the conditions for which that could happen might emerge, and we have to be careful and vigilant not to let that happen. So keep that in mind, right? Okay, so let's talk about European integration. What is this? What are we talking about? Well, you can talk about political integration. Europe is becoming politically integrated. There's the European semester system, and we have all this checking of national budgets and vetting of national policies. European Court of Justice is involved in a lot of things that are going on in the state. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about economic integration. I'm talking about what happens on the ground. Can I work in France? Can I buy French goods without paying a tariff? Can I invest in France? So that's kind of the important, can I put my money in a bank in France without somebody checking? Is that okay? Well, that's kind of what economic integration is for me. I'm going to talk about efficiency versus fairness in this course. So a lot of people think, European integration is all about making people in Poland as wealthy as people in Germany. That's not a good definition of economic integration, because you can obviously just take wealth from people in Germany and give it to Polish people. That's one way of making people equal, but that may not be efficient, right? So we're really thinking about ways of creating, out of the given resources we have, more economic resources for everybody. So we'll be using the Pareto condition, the Pareto criterion a lot in this course. We'll talk about measures of convergence. We'll talk about ways of measuring being well off, whether it be achieved through economic growth or efficiency, improving mechanisms, or whether it's just taxing and redistributing. Okay? And I'll give you a brief history lesson as well. So that's kind of my objective so take a look at Europe right now. Okay, this is a map from 2016. Don't be worried. I've actually updated this lecture. So I have data from 2022. But I want you to take a long, hard look at this. The EU is a big place. It's huge. 500 million people. That's a lot of people right there. 510 million folks. Okay, and if you do the density calculation, it's about 115 people per square kilometer. GDP in total, this is in 2016, 15 trillion euros, comes to about 30,000 per capita. That's GDP per capita per man, woman, child. Okay? 230 million people working. That's a pretty high employment rate, if you think about it. And GDP per employed person, 64,000. Now, fast forward to 2022, Suddenly population has dropped by a lot. What happened? Brexit. Boy, that was a blow. So we talk about L in this course. The L for European integration just dropped by a lot. Okay? First loss. You also see that the landmass went down. Okay, that's pretty obvious. Population density changed a little bit. It went down. So Britain is kind of, or the UK is kind of a highly densely populated part of Europe. What happened to GDP is also interesting. Well, it went up for economic growth reasons, despite Brexit. The UK is a richer part of the European Union. Per capita GDP went up, despite the fact that Britain is considerably wealthier than average. Okay, GDP per employed person also went up. So part of that's a consequence of economic growth. But if you correct for the loss of the UK, it was actually a minus for the EU. We're losing like a really potential heavyweight partner. So they're out, okay, for all the things we'll talk about in a while. So let's compare that to the United States. Here's the US. It's also an integrated economic, much more integrated economic unit. Fewer people. Okay, so we'll fast forward to 2022. You can look at the slide if you'd like later. 330 million people. Well, you can see there was quite a bit of population growth through immigration and natural births, net increase in population. Landmass is much larger, so the density of the United States is about a third of Europe. Keep that in mind, a third. It's a lot of vast expanse of the United States that hasn't even been developed yet, and that's why it's a very attractive place if you think land is a productive factor of production. Now look carefully at GDP per capita. Compare that to Europe in 2016. Okay, 35,000. The United States, 72,000. That's a huge difference. And you can attribute it to lots of different things. Economics, we learned in macro, what does it have to do with? Per capita. It has a lot to do with how many capita are actually working. So even though a lot of people are working in Europe, it's not as many as a fraction of the population. So why are more people in America working? Higher retirement age? More women in the labor force? More students in the United States actually working? All these things can contribute to a higher labor force participation. So this is kind of, and if you look at the GDP per employee, it's also quite higher. So that's the thing that's kind of worrisome for Europe. There are regions of Europe that are still severely underdeveloped with respect to the average. I'll show you in a second. Okay, so it's about development. I mean, Romania and Bulgaria are way behind the European average. Not to pick on those countries. Greece is behind the European average for reasons we'll have to discuss. Okay, so there's a dynamic within Europe development, convergence of production possibilities within the European Union, not just the average, but the average is brought down by these stragglers. The European Central Bank provides the means of payment for a subset of European Union countries. So it's not the same thing. The Eurozone is not the same thing as the European Union. You'll see that the Eurozone is actually, since the UK has left, actually better off than it was before relative to the European Union, but there are a lot of wealthy European Union countries that do not participate in the euro, okay? Like Sweden, for example, Denmark. Now they're small, but they're important. The UK was also not participating. UK was important. I mean, significant in terms of size. Okay, so, we talk about political integration, we talk about economic integration. I don't want to distinguish them too much because they are important. You have to have a political mechanism to decide the economic rules of the game. Political integration may improve matters. If you have a common law, a common set of rules, it may accelerate economic integration. The hope is that Bulgaria joins the European Union, it gets the European charter, the European the European chapters on economic regulation and competition policy, and that will improve matters for those European countries that are joining. At the same time, economic integration may enhance political integration, because if you own each other's real estate and you own each other's production means of production, and if you're working in the other countries, it reduces the chance that you'll be fighting with these other regions of the world. And there are lots of examples of that. I don't have to mention them. I put them down here anyway. Think of Germany and France. Erzfeinde, you know? I mean, go, depending on who you talk to, whether you talk to Germans or French people, you know, the first war between Germany and France might have been fought a couple of thousand years ago, or at least 1,000 years ago. But in more recent times, since the 19th century, it's been just terrible. So what we're experiencing right now is peace and prosperity between these two countries. Ireland, I already mentioned. The unification of Ireland is a project maybe that's going to happen in the next 100 years, but why? Why bother? If you're trading with each other and you're peaceful, etc. And one of the big dangers that the Brexit project caused was the potential separation, division of Ireland, restriction of trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Because a lot of people in both sides have a stake in trading with those regions, huge stake. Maybe getting rid of some of these religious sectarian differences that dominate the discussion. Currently, I don't know if you've watched or read it in the news, but Serbia and Kosovo are making peace with each other because they both want to join the European Union. And you might say that's a very cynical way of looking at it, but it's true. And if we can do something to put those guys, you know, at peace with each other, we should do it. And we might even profit from it. Okay, so that brings me to two definitions for you, something to write down if you're not taking notes. Efficiency. The efficiency criterion is one way of defining integration. So this sounds a little bit like Pareto efficiency. Okay, so when two or more regions can achieve the efficient production pattern that is made possible by their union. So if I put together France and Germany, what can I do out of that couldn't be done with Germany and France just existing with a big wall between them? So that's an efficiency definition. And you know, it's a little bit like Pareto, because taking it from one and giving it to the other doesn't help. It may make one person happy or one less happy, but it doesn't improve matters on the efficiency criterion. So we can always apply that, and we will apply it in a few seconds. Now you can contrast that with a different approach, which is to say, does this guy have more than me? Is that fair? Okay, so that's a different criterion. It's one based on outcomes as opposed to the causation of the difference. Okay, so if you can take some indicator and say that, well, the GDP per capita between East and West Germany has come together, then we have convergence. That's kind of a measure of integration, right? But a lot of people would say, well, that's not what economics is about. And that's my position. I mean, I like to look at these indicators, but I'm not sure that's really what economics is about. Economics comes from the Greek, which means household, Haushalt, budget. Okay, I've only got a fixed amount of resources. How can I make the most of that? I have a fixed number of cows in Germany and France. How can I make the best use of those cows in whatever way you like? You don't have to even kill them. You just milk them or show them to people who are visiting from other countries. But how can I do that in an efficient way, as opposed to just, you know, doing it in some way that doesn't maximize an outcome? So I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about Germany, because Germany is a great example of European integration. East and West Germany coming together. I'll talk about Euroland, because European Monetary Union has given a means to accelerate in the most intensive way by equalizing prices in a common currency, if not in a common quality adjusted price, conditions for integration. We'll talk about the Eastern Enlargement Project. because that's one of the ongoing projects. And if you think about Ukraine, before the war, Ukraine was on its way to becoming integrated. I have an example of that in this course. I'll show you the data on Ukraine, and you can see that things were going well, not as well as one had hoped. Capital mobility was low because people were scared of exactly what's happening right now, but it was still higher than it was before the European Union opened its doors in a partnership situation. Okay, so those are the three backdrops I'd like to let's give some examples. Let's look at convergence. Think about East German, West German conditions before and after the wall came down. Most of you don't even know what I'm talking about. Okay, but I went to East Germany before the wall came down. I actually went and looked at it, and it was not pretty. It was highly polluted. People had low standards of living. They had to wait 10 years to get a car. So something wasn't quite right there. People may have been happy in their joint poverty. That's fine. But if you look at what happened since unification, you can see that overall ownership of, and again, this is not equal happiness, but it helps. It helps to have a refrigerator. It helps to have a car. It helps to have a cell phone. You can see that convergence between East and West Germany has proceeded quite rapidly. You can also look at macroeconomic indicators. So you look at private consumption measured in euros per capita, East and West. This is old data. By now we're about 90% consumption per capita. So East and West Germans are pretty much on the, especially if you remember, that doesn't measure everything. The first moment measures the central tendency and not the spread. The lower end of Eastern Germany is actually much higher than it is in Western Germany. Okay, so you have convergence at various quantiles of the distribution that has occurred. Okay, at the same time, productivity has not converged as quickly. So that's the big mystery for us economists, is why are East Germans still less productive than West Germans? On average, and in a lot of other ways as well. So that's one of the fascinating questions. And unemployment is still higher, although when I first started teaching this course, it was 15 to 20%, as opposed to 8 to 10%, okay, East-West. Now things have gotten quite similar. And of course, in the participation rate, East Germans were Weltmeister, female participation. Many more women were participating than men in the day. And women have probably inspired a lot of West German women to get into the labor force. It's my personal theory. How else can we measure welfare? What do you think? How else can we measure people's welfare? Not just how much money you have, how much you eat, how many cars you drive. Yeah. How long you live. Right. So health is a great indicator. And you need resources to make yourself healthy or keep yourself healthy. So rich countries have longer lifespans, expected lifespans. They have lower infant mortality. They have better care for the poorest people, on average, not always. So one of the most fascinating statistics for me is to look at this data. Okay, how is life expectancy for men and women converged? And you can see that they diverged in the 1970s. East Germany was not doing well, and West Germany was still kind of plugging along. You notice that the men are still worse off in the East than they are in the West. Almost a year's difference, even if you update that to 2022. In fact, since COVID, it's actually gotten a little bit larger. Women, the same. Identical pretty much since 2000. Okay, so this is a great indication of convergence. If you look across European countries, you don't see that, and you can see this in the COVID statistics. Cumulative deaths since 2019 attributable to COVID, big differences. It seems to correlate a lot with GDP per capita. Okay, so we have a lot of work to do. Europe needs to figure out ways to organize that. How else can you measure well-being? You can ask people if they're happy or not. Okay, you can ask people if they're happy, because happiness is highly correlated with GDP per capita. Okay, it's also highly correlated with wealth per capita. right? It's not clear what the causation is, but it's certainly an indication that something is there. Okay, so you can make yourself miserable in the best way possible. You know, if you're happy, what you can see is a lot of these countries in Eastern Europe also improved considerably, but since the war broke out and since the impending war broke out, you can see that they deteriorated. All right, so what else do we need to talk about? We need to talk about the measures across country variation. Again, we want to talk about GDP per capita in the first instance as a measure of well-being. We're also interested in we're not just interested in the central tendency, we're looking at the standard deviation across countries. Okay, so the good news is that after European integration began, say starting in 2000 to 2004, things did get better, and then we had the financial crisis. Things got worse. So some countries like Greece and Portugal, Spain, had real setbacks, Italy as well. Things are improving, and I invite you to take a look at this table in detail at your leisure. Note what we've done. We've taken the absolute measure, euros, actually in US dollars in this particular, so it's a common currency. We've taken the deviation from the mean as a measure of the spread of the distribution, and we've looked at the summary statistic, like the weighted average, because you want to weight the large countries more heavily. There have been some setbacks in European integration. That's why we need to do the theory well, to think about that. Okay, so we need macro and micro for this course, just to go quickly. Both are essential for studying European integration. Macroeconomics gives us the means to have a broad brush stroke assessment, but we need to understand the micro. So we start in this course with micro. We'll talk about the underlying motivations for countries to grow, to mobilize capital, to invest in other parts of the European Union, and also why it makes sense to trade. So economics of trade is very important, and the gains from trade are important. And of course, politics are crucial. All right, so let's move quickly through this. Monetary motivates the second part of the course, why we think about money, why money matters, why we break things up in terms of monetary versus real, and of course that motivates why an optimal currency area might be relevant for Europe, whether Europe might be better off adopting a single currency, and then of course what kind of policy issues do you have. Okay, we talked about monetary, we talked about fiscal, we talked about all the real integration, we talked about trade. Now let's go back to this positive versus normative. We discussed this already. Positive economics is what I'll be teaching in this course, but I'd like to see you come out and in your discussions with your friends and your relatives and in your public life to think about how you can use what you're doing. So you have your own view, whether we need to have more measures to combat inequality, for example, or whether you need to have more competition policy. These are all things that are kind of guiding your own personal feelings and your own judgments. But in the end, we'd like you to be guided by the theory. So we'll do mostly positive economics in this course. And, to understand that, and again, this goes back to the whole reason of the European Union. Why was the European Union started in the first place? We'll talk about this question that came about after 1945, after World War II was over. So this is the question why European integration might be a good idea. What is the defining characteristic of Europe since the Middle Ages? Okay, so anybody have an idea? I mean, be nice. Don't you have to be nasty? Yeah. Trade. Okay, yeah, but the Chinese were experts at trade until they closed things down, right? 2,000 years ago, or I don't know, 1,300 years ago, 700 years ago. No. Let's be positive about Europe, positive in the good sense. What is good about Europe? What's one of the guiding ideas of European intellectual development since the 1600s? Yeah, I am. Exactly. So the Europeans should be proud of this. They inspired the Americans. In fact, they were American. Americans were Europeans, right? They took the ideas of Locke and others that thought about what freedom means, right? Because the Europeans were revolting against repression in the most primitive sense, having a king who just did what he wanted, or a duke or a lord. So the Europeans were like at the front line combating this. So this is a positive aspect, right? Now the negative aspect is what? I mean, a lot of freedom, but during this period of freedom and discovery, intellectual development, we had lots of wars. So lots of parts of the world didn't have this type of, never-ending combat for whatever reasons. Okay, so this is a European, unfortunate European aspect, especially the last 200 years. And the two world wars originated in Europe, without a question. So how can Europe avoid a war? That was the guiding question in 1945. How can Europe do something to? You have to have a theory. Why do we fight this war in the first place? Well, you could blame the loser. It's their fault. You can also blame the system. You can say it was capitalism's fault. You can also blame nationalism. Okay, so the Allied powers had to decide which view, because they were reconstructing Europe at the time. And the question is, which one did they choose? Well, the three sources, if you blame Germany for everything, the obvious thing to do is just to neutralize Germany from the start. So there were a lot of people who wanted to do this in 1945. Take away all of Germany's industrial capacity forever. Okay? Not exactly the smartest idea. That was embodied in an actual plan that didn't get implemented. And the second one was to go for the communist approach. Means of production, centralized, that's the way to solve the problem. The final approach, which was adopted, which was maybe we need to get Europe on the same track in terms of economic development, openness, and this might be a way of preventing conflict. You're not going to be able to, Europe has some inherent disadvantages. High population density, different languages, different culture, and different histories to which we refer. What kind of history do you learn in Denmark as opposed to what history do you learn when you live in Germany? They're just completely different histories. Because at the micro level, most of European history is microscopic. And the development of the nation state was inevitably going to involve the national histories of those microscopic bits. Okay? Is anybody from Denmark here? So usually I have a lot of international students. I don't know, for some reason this year. Okay. So there are a lot of people. That show up from different countries, Erasmus types and stuff. It's great because we can always just call on them and ask their personal opinion. But what kind of history did you learn when you were in school? You didn't necessarily learn the history of those other guys. Okay. So when Europe emerged, you have to remember the Allied powers, including the Soviet Union, divided Europe. It created a natural experiment, unnatural natural experiment, by putting up a wall and preventing trade between these two blocks, because eventually trade between the two blocks went to zero. And the greatest example of that was Germany. Okay, so you have East Germany, Soviet Union. West Germany, UK, United States, and the French occupying these regions. History's developed on their own. The Allied powers from the West kind of told West Germany how to develop, and they did, because it wasn't such a bad system. The East Germans didn't have much of a choice, and they went for their system. This was a defining moment in the disintegration of Europe. The Iron Curtain, to use Churchill's phrase, right? So again, imagine the consequences for trade and economic development between these two regions. Stopping migration, stopping capital mobility, stopping trade of goods and services. These were huge developments. Okay? So, referring to the West, the USA, as a vanquishing power, basically offered lots of financial assistance to countries that wanted to agree to adopt their type of system, a market system. And the United States actually gave quite a bit of financial aid, the Marshall Plan, allowing countries to import U.S. goods. Of course, it was a self-centered type of policy for the United States, but it did help Europe get on its feet again. It was a little bit like capital mobility in the sense of a gift. At the same time, trade liberalization meant pro-growth policies, and you can see that from this table. There was a huge difference in economic growth, especially in terms of exports. So these European countries that were developing were also becoming very good at what they were doing. Again, Italy was not an industrial country before World War II, especially southern Italy, but in the consequence of the Marshall Plan, the Italian economy had its best years in the 1950s, 1960s. Same is true for the rest of, whereas the UK and the United States actually didn't do so well because they weren't destroyed, they didn't have a chance to renovate. So at the same time, you have this issue of, okay, who gets to trade with whom? These are small countries. We know that trade is important. It's important to have some trade. We'll learn about why in a second. So what emerged was kind of two different alliances of free trade. A lot of people don't know this, but the European Economic Community was the precursor of the European Union, and it was just a subset, a small subset. France, Spain, Italy, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg. It was a steel trading community. On the other hand, you had the UK and the Scandinavian countries, Iceland, Finland, sort of a liberal, maybe alternative, because the European Economic Community was rather heavy-handed at first in terms of what its objectives were. And then you had Greece and Spain totally outside the system. And when I mean totally outside the system, it means not just no tariffs within the system and tariffs externally, but also restricted mobility and restricted access to capital markets. Okay, so the first thing that happened is that these two regions became very successful. So it became obvious that this was a good idea. Some free trade was a good idea. Some specialization. It's a good idea for the French to specialize in certain goods, Germans in others. Good idea for the UK to specialize. So what emerged was kind of a situation where there was increasing integration within the EEC and increasing interest from the UK even to join this. So Denmark, Ireland, and the UK started petitioning to join, and the UK was actually blocked by the French in the 1960s. Anybody from France here? No. This is great. This is a really genius. Okay, so your parents will remember this. Ask them. Okay, but de Gaulle was a real hero for the French in the 1950s and 60s, you know, and it's always been a mystery why he blocked the very country that gave him refuge during World War II. It's a complete mystery. There are people who can explain it, but it's an interesting development. In the end, you see this competing concentric circle arrangement meant that the Scandinavian countries, the Nordic countries, to be honest, including Finland and Iceland, became sort of marginalized, and because Germany and France and Italy grew so fast, and the UK joined in 1973, that increased their economic power. So it's a little bit like a race, and as a result, this inner circle became bigger and bigger, and eventually many of the other countries capitulated. I'll show you the picture in a second. So this was intensified by Jacques Delors offering the option of increasing what we mean by free trade, not just trade in goods, but also trade in services. And when I say services, I mean banking. Okay? I mean people who are lawyers and doctors can go to other countries and practice. So this is a huge, revolutionary idea, meaning that mobility of people became a new mechanism for European integration. And this is kind of enshrining what the four freedoms are about. The four freedoms: movement of goods, people, services, and capital. Okay, so those are going to be the basis for the rest of this course. This was enacted in 1987. That was the year I came to Europe for the first time. So I actually got to see this start, and a lot of people were very scared. A lot of French banks were worried the German banks would take them over. A lot of German banks were worried the Italian banks would come over. There was a lot of concern. How can we erect barriers to prevent this from happening? So overcoming this nationalist instinct was difficult. So the single market was about trying to get around that problem. So harmonizing, getting rid of border controls. So that was an amazing step. I could tell you stories about that. Harmonizing technical standards. The French like to have the yellow lights. When I came to France, the yellow headlights. And if you were a German car manufacturer, you had to put yellow lights on your car if you wanted to sell the car in France. That is a subtle non-tariff barrier, okay? Because it makes production of German cars more expensive to sell into France. These things were eliminated over time. So that was a real progress because it was obviously a way of preventing trade. Removing capital controls, meaning you could move your resources, your money, your wealth to another country, not necessarily in an illegal way, but a way of enabling German companies to invest in France and for French companies to invest in Germany. Okay? Mutual regulation of regulation policies and regulatory agencies is very important. The establishment of standards for that. Then came the collapse of communism. So imagine this all happening, and then 3 years later, the wall comes down. 2.5 years later. And then 3 years later, German unification. This is sort of the very beginning of the European integration project as we know it. So this was very exciting. Exciting time for economists, but also exciting time for people who do business. And it was sort of like a domino. First, Hungary opened up its border with Austria, allowing people to move back and forth. Very sensible idea. Czechoslovakia, mass protests in the GDR, followed by unification. Democracy established in a somewhat violent way in Romania, when Ceausescu was thrown out and killed. Bulgaria, and then we had the breakup of the Soviet Union. So that was a really monumental event. Because if you remember your history, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia were not part of Russia before 1939. They weren't part of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union grabbed them as a result of the secret pact with Hitler's Germany. Okay, so that these things, all these European ghosts start coming up, start rearing their heads, and then the USSR breaks up. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics breaks up, and then we have the end. So this collapse of communism meant that we now have the opening up of economic possibilities that European integration could provide. Now, how does Europe deal with that? Europe comes back and says, look, we've got to deal with this. We've got to allow trade with these guys. We've got to give them a roadmap to get into the European Union. And then, and many will dispute this, but it seems to be part of the grand deal of allowing German unification seems to be adopting what the Werner Report advocated in 1970, which was a common currency. Okay, so we can discuss this later in detail. There are a lot of people who deny it, but there are a lot of people who say it's actually what it was. We have the common currency on the table in the Maastricht Treaty, which I'll go into detail in later on in the course. Single currency, which was adopted in 2002. So again, a lot of people didn't like this. So it's like a spectrum of measures that you want to accept. Some people have no problem with it. Some people have a few problems with it, and some people don't want to have anything to do with it at all. Okay, you know who I'm talking about. Okay, so you know, Europe is, the great thing about Europe is that Europe lives from its diversity. It's actually the motto of the European Union, right? Unity in diversity. So we should be happy we don't all speak the same language because it makes us more interesting. Okay? But the Danish said, no, nay, we don't want to have that. The British said, no, we don't have a common currency. But they didn't opt out of the European Union, so there must have been some benefit from that. Okay, so we have this Copenhagen summit, which basically gave the roadmap for these countries to join the European Union. Huge step. You do this, you adopt the chapters of the Treaty of Rome, and we will let you come in. Okay, because you have to do that. Countries cannot change their laws, from one day to the next. It takes a long time for that to happen. If it's a democracy, they have to be discussed, and the implications have to be discussed. So I see this as a reunification of Europe in a number of steps, basically moving towards the Treaty of Lisbon and basically these enlargements that we see. So we talk about enlargements when the European countries have achieved the necessary conditions to join the European Union. The accession occurs, but the process of adjustment already occurs 6 or even 10 years before, depending on how long it takes to get in. Okay, so you can see the European accession. All these colored these colored countries have joined in some sense, and of course, one did not stay, and that's what I'm going to get to later on in this course. So let me spend the last 15 minutes doing some economics, because again, this is very difficult to put in an abstract economic model. So how am I going to do that? Well, for me, as an economist, the first thing I want to think about is why are parts of this map very poor and why are parts very rich? So that's the economic question. What is the source of the wealth? And when I say wealth, I could be talking about how much stock of wealth you have, how much you own, but I'm talking about how productive you are. I'm talking about GDP per capita. So that's my metric for discussing the differences. And again, this is a very heterogeneous map. And you have countries next to each other, they're doing well, some aren't doing well. So I need to abstract from all this difference and talk about the rich part and the poor part. And that's why economics helps us abstractly analyze these questions. It's an abstraction. Karl Marx said that. Economics is an abstraction. We can't do experiments, and we can't replicate reality. Even in a computer, we're not going to get it all right because there are millions of people out there making decisions, right? So we need a model to think about this. That's what a model does for us. It helps us think about it. So it's a broad concept, and we also have this difference in efficiency and equity. I'm going to talk about efficiency, and I'm going to talk about a framework for thinking about this. So I can always redistribute. If I can get more efficient, I can give some of the efficiency gains to the people who didn't get any of the efficiency gains. I can redistribute. So the first question for me is the efficiency question, right? And again, this is a trade-off involved. Sometimes in a market economy, if you have more efficiency, you may lose a little bit of fairness. So you may have to devise public policies as a way of moving resources. Still, we want to be on that frontier. We don't want to be inside the frontier. Okay, so for a given amount of fairness, I want to be as efficient as possible. I like to think about Scandinavia. People always make fun of how the Scandinavian countries, they have high taxes and highly regulated social welfare system, but they're also very wealthy. So they've managed to do very well. Given the fact they want to have lots of fairness and redistribution, they're still doing quite well, right? So think about that as, as long as you're on the curve, you're doing the best you can, but you don't want to be inside the curve. So what kind of analysis am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about the sources of GDP per capita for me. And if you go to the Solo model, what are the sources of GDP per capita? Who remembers? Do you remember? What's the source of GDP? I'm looking at you. No, government spending. That's not. Maybe it's the source of your wealth. It's not a source of my wealth. Yeah. Capital. Okay, I mean you're way ahead of the game. Capital makes us able to produce, and we need people. People, work, effort, labor. Labor in the form of work hours. Hours per person. Those are the sources of wealth for a common production function. Okay, so I've said three things: capital, labor, and an efficient production function. Now, I can't just invent an efficient production function. We're kind of that's given to us by technology and by development, scientific development. Right, before we had iPhones, I couldn't tell what time it is right now. Okay, I have to look at my watch. So these three sources of economic development are important, and I'm going to say for a common production function, it's all about capital and labor. Capital and labor. I can be a rich country or a rich region if I have lots of people who are working, holding the capital constant, or I can have lots of capital for a few people. And it turns out what matters for per capita is capital per capita, capital intensity. Right? So the poor people and the poor countries in that map I showed you have less capital per capita than Germany and France does. That's a fact. Okay? Even if you give them the same technology, they don't have enough K to give to their L to make them work. So to think about this, I need a neoclassical production function. I need to go back to Macro 1 and write down the neoclassical production function. F is the same in my region and your region, so it's all about K and L. If I have lots of K and lots of L, I'm going to have lots of GDP per capita. I'm going to be producing lots of goods and services with the inputs that I have. So you talked about government spending. That's the way we use it. Okay, but it's not how we produce it. Now, of course, what I'm doing right now is actually output as well as I'm G, right? Because Germany pays for me, therefore I am G, right? But the production function still involves my capital and my labor, my computer and my standing up here and doing this stuff, okay? Remember, macro teaches us you have sources and uses. So G is important, but it's a use, not a source, okay? So I need that production function. It's neoclassical. What does that mean? Constant returns to scale. The size doesn't matter. What matters is the K per unit of labor, if the production function is the same. But if I can get a better production function, I can be even more productive. Okay? So, one reason Germany was more productive than Poland in 1990 was that the Germans had more productive technologies. But now Poland and Germany are pretty much on the same track, right? Information is flowing freely between Poland and Germany. Firms are just as free to start their stuff over there. The German firms can move over there. So we're talking about a simple analysis of integration. So simple, you will probably smile at it, but it's important to get that in the back of your head before you start talking about other stuff. So both regions have access to the same production function in what I'm about to show you, the same production function. So F is the same. You can allow F to be different, but if we exchange ideas, we're going to converge to each other in terms of the production function, the production technology. We're going to ignore those differences right now, but later on we'll come back to them because some of those differences in technology can be laws, rules of behavior. If you just have random people coming and taking money from you, that makes it less attractive to do business, right? You're less productive. Maybe you don't work so hard because you know that guy's going to stick you for a holdup. All these things happen at the same time. Maybe the laws are not very, very clear. People have ambiguities. So neoclassical production function, what does it look like? Well, I'm going to give you a three-dimensional picture. It looks like this. Okay, vertical is output. Horizontal in the left-right direction is labor input, and forward-backward is capital. This is a visualization you've probably never seen before, but it's exactly what it means to put the production function in three dimensions. So the more capital you have, the more you can produce, the more labor you have produced, the more you can produce, holding the other factor constant, and that means you're reaching a higher point on output, which is what we care about. But we really care about output per person or per capita. And if the capitas are working at the same rate and the same fraction, it's really about capita. Now, of course, in France, workers work less than they do in Germany in terms of hours per capita. So that means that the French will always have a little bit less GDP per capita because they have more fun. But Hours worked is what's mattering, okay? So I'm going to divide by L. I'm going to assume that L equals population, so therefore we can talk about capita, and I'm just going to divide. So what happens then is I get what's called the intensive form. Okay, because if I project this in the YL space, I get this. And if I project it in the KY space, I get this. So these are like holding anything to do with labor constant. What can I do with more capital? I can increase output. And if I hold capital constant, I get more output. Okay, that's a very nasty way of describing a production function. So what am I going to do? I'm going to divide by L. I'm going to make it an intensive form production function. And if I do that, constant returns to scale says I can do that. So output per capita is a function of capital per capita. 1 is irrelevant. You can't change 1. It's always the same. So it's capital per capita. So getting a country richer means getting capital per capita up. How can I raise it? And the most striking difference between Eastern and Western Europe after the wall came down was the Eastern Europeans and the East Germans had less capital per capita than the West Germans and the West Europeans. So how do we change that? That's what European integration is about. That's why I look at the Edgeworth box to think about this. So I'm going to try to get this finished in 5 minutes, because this is really easy. Get you thinking. And if you want to think more about it, watch the lecture. An Edgeworth box basically allocates what we have between person A and person B, or region East, region West, or region Finland and region Poland. So I'll take that as a metaphor. Two countries integrating with each other. They have a fixed amount of total labor. They have a fixed amount of total capital. And the question is, where do they allocate it? So point E is the endowment. That's where they start. When the wall came down, a lot of Poles looked over in Finland and said, wow, they're doing pretty well over here. How come? A lot of Finnish businessmen looked over there and said, wow, that looks like an opportunity for me. But where does that come from? It comes from the fact that E is up there, and E, the way you look at it, implies a very high capital labor ratio for Finland and a low capital labor ratio for Poland. That's the initial condition of European integration. And this is a metaphor for the entire European continent. Okay, so E is the starting point. Now you can see, if you just have to stare at this, and you see that the angle formed by the point connecting the origin for Finland to point E is steeper than from the perspective of Poland looking the other way. Their capital labor ratio is lower. So what does this tell you? The neoclassical production function tells you what? It tells you that Finland is richer than Poland, even if Poland and Finland had the same production function, right? Now we know that Poland actually also had some problems with other things that may have given them a different production function, but abstracting from that, this is already an interesting starting point for European integration. So how do you solve this problem? How do we integrate these two regions? Okay, so how can we make this more efficient? So what's your gut reaction if you look at that? What's the point of efficient allocations of labor and capital between these two regions? After we let the curtain fall, E is not efficient. And Bervin will tell you why. Yes?
Capital and labor, we have to move more in the middle of the box.
Right. We want to move to the diagonal because the diagonal is the set of efficient points. Okay? The diagonal, again, maybe Polish people don't speak Finnish, that's all possible. But if this is the production function, then we somehow need to get to the diagonal. Okay? So that's a consequence of the theory. The theory says you need to get capital per worker up in Finland, and maybe we have too much capital in Finland, and this sounds like a way of increasing everyone's welfare because we can move that capital, and we could even tax the winners and give it to the losers. right? This is the logic. Now, okay, you might say, I don't want to do that. No, we're not going to do that. You can still make things better off just by asking the Poles to accumulate more capital. Okay, because the Solo model says we can make the Poles richer by asking them to save more. And they save, increase their K over L. Okay, so you could do this. You could make, that's why it's called a modified Edgeworth box, because if they save over time, that savings results in more capital stock, and that means they have more capital. So the Finns don't have to do anything. They just sit on their butts and do nothing. Okay? So that's a movement towards more efficient. Still not efficient. To make it efficient, we'd have to be off the diagram. What's the problem with that solution? Remember the Solo model. Takes forever. It's going to take a long time because the Finns, the Poles today have to save. Means they can't consume. So they have to defer consumption for future gain. You're asking a lot of people in Poland to open their piggy banks and start putting money in there and forsaking consumption. Of course, in the long run, they're better off. In a world where it was a closed economy, that would exactly what would happen. Poland would have to save to converge. Fortunately, we don't have to do that. Okay, so we can actually move resources within the Edgeworth box. And that's probably what we're going to focus on for the next couple of lectures. Okay, so we could have capital mobility. The arrow indicates the Finns move some of their equipment, some of their machines, some of their trucks, cars, whatever that are used for production, train cars, factories. I've seen factories moved. It is possible. And this means that those Finns don't have the capital to work with anymore because the jobs have left. The jobs have moved. So the rhetoric of the demagogues would be, well, jobs are moving from Finland to Poland. That's exactly what's happening. So there will be some misery, the Finns who lose their jobs and have to move into other sectors. There will be some losers. We'll have to compensate them. Okay? You can also have the other solution. What's the other solution? What's the most obvious issue of European integration right now? Yeah, so you can move people instead of moving the machines. Move the Poles to Finland, and a lot of Poles did go to Finland. Good jobs, high-paying jobs, because it wasn't an efficient allocation in the beginning. So you could do this one. The vector goes in the other direction. Again, this is a dynamic vector. This is like dl dt. It's the change of L. And dl for Finland is negative. dl for Poland is positive. It is a zero-sum game. But an economic outcome is not a zero-sum game, it's a positive gain. Okay, so take the sum of those two vectors and you do eventually reach the diagonal. And what determines that is the forces behind migration and capital mobility. Finally, the good news is they don't possibly have to do that at all. You might be able to trade your way into an efficient allocation. So it might be possible that point E could be efficient if there are two different goods. One is more labor intensive than the other, or more capital intensive than the other. Finland would specialize in the capital intensive production relatively, and Poland would specialize relatively in the labor intensive good. But you have to have two goods. And you don't have to have complete specialization. So, people say globalization. Well, a little trade can take you a long way. So if you have two goods, if you have agriculture and manufactured goods, maybe Finland would produce a bit more manufactured and Poland would produce a little bit more agriculture, and you can still achieve full employment under these conditions. So that's the magic one that we'll spend a lot of time talking about, because there is some potential there, especially in the European integration context. We can also criticize it because there are some problems with that. People do lose their jobs, right? We already said it before. So how do you compensate the losers? That's a really important question. Okay, so I'm done. Key concepts. Always important to remember those. This is a very strong signal what could be on the final exam. And the slides are available. You don't have to take pictures. You're welcome to do so. The 4 mechanisms of integration are very important, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Please remember the section, and please look at the Moodle site. Okay? Thanks.